The room had been arranged for ceremony, which was the solicitor's first mistake. Cranby had brought his own candlesticks, a pair of brass ones taller than anything in the Merton drawing room, and placed them at either end of the writing desk as though the reading of a dead man's will required the atmosphere of a consecration. The effect might have impressed a widow or a young woman accustomed to deference. It did not impress Cecily. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her mother beside her on the low settee near the window, the autumn light falling in pale columns across the turkey rug. Across the room, the Viscount Ashford stood with his shoulder almost against the bookcase, a position that gave him sightlines to the desk and to the door simultaneously. Cecily had noted it the moment he entered. Cranby cleared his throat. He wore his best coat. He had his clerk at a small table to the left, pen ready, and Mrs. Dorothea Pell arranged in the wing chair as though she had furnished the house herself. Her son, Mr. Selden. Pell hovered behind her with the slightly pained expression of a man who understood he was a prop. The will was a fair copy, Cranby said. The original was lodged with his firm. He began to read. Cecily listened. She had listened to Latin her entire life. Her father's voice reading Cicero at the breakfast table. Her father's voice correcting her declensions on wet Tuesday afternoons when the parish offered nothing else. She had read the Aeneid at 14 and the Philippics at 16, and had helped her younger brother with his schoolwork so steadily that by the time he left for Oxford, she suspected he knew less Latin than she did. Her father's Latin was particular. He favored Ciceronian syntax. He held the ablative absolute dear. He disliked the genitive construction that later authors favored and had opinions, strong and specific, about the corruption of the classical form across 5 centuries of ecclesiastical usage. The 4th clause of the will named the bequest of the Merton living and the modest acreage that abutted it. The verb was wrong. Cecily went, still. Not conspicuously, not in any way that would draw a glance. She simply stopped moving. Stopped the small adjustments of posture that mark a woman listening to something dull. She heard the rest of the clause. She heard the 5th clause in which the personal library was bequeathed, and she heard the phrase that closed it. And that phrase was not Ciceronian. It was not anything her father would have written. It was the sort of phrase a man who had learned his Latin from a primer might produce when attempting to sound like a scholar. The sort of phrase that had the shape of learning without its substance. Her father had been very particular about that shape. She did not speak. Not yet. She listened to the remainder of the document, and she kept her hands folded and her face composed, and she did not look at Nathaniel Ashby, Viscount Ashford, standing against the bookcase with his gray eyes level and his jaw set like something carved from the hillside outside. She had met him for the first time yesterday. Or rather, they had been introduced yesterday, which was not quite the same thing. Cecily Merton had been born into a family that owned nothing in excess, but owed nothing either, which her father had always considered a tolerable position. Reverend Thomas Merton had held the living at Sallerton for 22 years, had tutored the sons of 3 neighboring families for modest fees, had kept a kitchen garden and a library, had taught his daughter Latin and his sons Latin and Greek and something about the value of a clear sentence, and had died of a fever in January of the previous year with his affairs, so far as anyone understood them, in reasonable order. He had been a small, precise man who wore the same coat on Sundays for 11 years and kept a fire in the library, even when the rest of the house was cold. Because, he said, one could endure anything in a warm room with something to read. He had been gentle and stubborn, and wrong about only one thing, so far as Cecily could determine, which was the assumption that the law would protect what he had spent his life building. The will had been produced by Mr. Garr. Cranby 3 weeks after the funeral. It had named, to the considerable surprise of both Cecily and her mother, Mrs. Merton's distant cousin's son, a Mr. Gregory Pell of Bristol, as the primary beneficiary of the estate. The Merton women were left a small annuity and the right to remain in the house for 1 calendar year while the estate's transfer was arranged. The calendar year was nearly concluded. It was Mrs. Cremond, Dorothea Pell, who had introduced the phrase that spread through Sallerton in the weeks that followed. She had arrived for the initial reading in a carriage that was somewhat too fine for the Merton Lane, and had arranged herself in the drawing-room with the assurance of a woman coming into her own. She had said it to her son in the entrance hall, at the conclusion of that first visit, in the voice she used for statements she did not consider controversial. "Poor thing," she had said, adjusting her gloves before the hall mirror. "A pauper's daughter at the end of it. One must be practical." She had not been speaking quietly. She had perhaps not thought to be. The footman by the door had a wife, who spoke to the baker's wife, and the baker's wife spoke to everyone, and within 4 days, the essential phrase had circulated through Sallerton, stripped of its softening prefix, traveling as phrases do when they catch on something true and sharp. Cecily had heard it repeated at the milliner's shop from behind a bolt of serge, not to her, but near her. She had received it with the equanimity she had been practicing since the morning she first read the will's 4th clause and understood, with a certainty that had no formal proof to support it, that something in it was very wrong. 8 months she had sat with that certainty. 8 months of reading and rereading, of writing out the errors on foolscap and then putting the foolscap in the fire, because there was no one to show it to, no one who would understand what the ablative construction meant and why it mattered, no one who would take the word of a woman of no standing against a solicitor of 30 years' good reputation. 8 months of watching her mother grow quieter and the house grow dimmer, the familiar rooms taking on the particular pallor of places that know they are about to be given to someone else. And then the vicar had written to Viscount Ashford, and the Viscount had come. He arrived at the Merton house at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in October, on horseback, with no carriage and no attendant beyond a single groom who he sent around to the stable-yard while he presented his card at the front door. Cecily had been in the library. She had not heard the door. She was at her father's desk, with the copy of the will laid flat before her, and her father's Latin grammar open beside it. She had her father's pen in her hand, not to mark the will itself, which she would not touch, but to make notes on a sheet of foolscap laid alongside. She had been at this work for 2 hours, and she was cold and precise, and entirely absorbed in the 4th clause, which she had by then identified as containing 3 distinct errors, each of which she could attribute to the specific gap between a man who had learned Latin well enough to imitate it and a man who had actually used it to think with. She did not hear the door. She was aware of him only when she reached for the grammar, and her hand paused at a sound she had not registered. Arriving, she looked up. He was in the doorway, which she had not closed. He was looking at the desk with an expression that was not quite readable, but that contained a kind of attention she had not expected. Not the attention of a man discovering a woman where he had not anticipated one, but the attention of a man who has found what he was looking for and is taking a moment to understand its dimensions. He came 3 paces into the room. He looked at the will, the grammar, the foolscap. "You are reading it," he said. His voice was low, and the words were level. "I am correcting it," Cecily said. She had not planned to say that. He looked at her. He did not apologize for the intrusion or retreat. He came 1 pace closer and looked at the foolscap without touching it. "How many errors?" he said. She told him. Not all of them, but the most serious ones. The verb in the 4th clause that could not follow the antecedent construction, as written. The genitive formation her father had called a barbarism in a letter she had found in his correspondence box 6 weeks after his death. The bequest formula in the 5th clause that read like a translation from English rather than an original Latin composition, which was not how her father had ever written anything. She did not soften it. There was no point in softening what she knew. He listened with his hands behind his back, and his face showing very little. But what it showed was not dismissal. His gray eyes were steady on her face, and in them she saw the specific quality of a man who is following an argument and has already made the judgment that the argument is sound. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Since the first reading," she said. 8 months. Something moved in his face, a compression around the mouth, a tightening of the jaw that was not directed at her. "And no one to tell," he said. It was not a question. No one who would understand the Latin, and no one who would take my word for it if they did not. He was quiet for another moment. I want to be in that room tomorrow when you say this. Do not speak of what you found until I am present. He paused. I mean that as a precaution, not a prohibition. She did not ask him what he intended. She understood that he did not yet know the full shape of it, and she understood also that he was not a man who made promises carelessly. She nodded, and he withdrew, and she sat for a long time in the quiet of her father's library, with the grammar in her hands, listening to the house settle around her. If she was aware, as she sat there, that her pulse had not quite returned to its usual rate, she attributed it to the cold. The morning of the reading arrived gray and still, with a frost on the lane that had not entirely lifted by the time the carriage bearing Mrs. Pell came into the yard. Cecily watched it from the landing window, her hands around a cup of tea. She had not drunk. She could see the quality of Mrs. Pell's hat through the carriage glass, which was very fine, and she observed that Mrs. Pell descended with the assurance of a woman who had spent the previous evening settling the question of how she would furnish this drawing-room when it was hers. Cecily went downstairs. The assembling of the parties was managed by Cranby with the efficiency of a man who knew that efficiency was in his interest. He placed Mrs. Pell in the best chair. He placed his clerk at the writing table. He placed Mr. Cramber Pell in the position of an heir designate without quite calling him one. He arranged the candlesticks he had brought. He arrived last, 5 minutes before the appointed hour, without ceremony. He spoke briefly to Cranby about the document's provenance, and then removed himself to the bookcase, where he stood without apology for the space he occupied, his dark coat against the spines of her father's books, his eyes moving at intervals around the room, with the systematic attention of a man who has spent years in rooms where the person who watches everything is not the person speaking. He did not look at Cecily often. When he did, it was brief and direct and told her nothing she could have articulated to another person. She was aware of him with the specific awareness of a needle to a compass point. Not performed attention, not effort, simply the involuntary orientation of a thing toward what has disturbed the field around it. She knew precisely where he was standing without needing to look. She was aware of the space between them as a specific distance, one that she found herself measuring without meaning to. She set this awareness aside with the practice she had acquired over 8 months of sitting in rooms with nothing useful to do with her hands. Cranby read. She listened. And then there was the 4th clause, and the verb was wrong, and everything that followed was already decided. What had not been decided was what Cranby would say when she said so. She had expected dismissal. She had not expected the particular quality of his dismissal, which was not contempt, because contempt would have been easier. It was patience. The patience of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and understood that women who raised procedural objections in drawing rooms were best handled with measured, paternal calm, the same tool one applied to a child who had misunderstood the rules of a game. Miss Merton, he said with the careful kindness of someone addressing a clever but confused junior, I understand this is a difficult time. The loss of your father has been considerable, and I do not wonder that the mind seeks explanations. The document was prepared with appropriate care, and the Latin formulations are standard for a will of this nature. I have prepared many such documents, and I assure you of that. I am not asking for your assurance, Cecily said. I'm asking for the original document, since we do not have it. This copy will serve. She began to read the 4th clause aloud. Miss Merton. His voice was still patient, still kind. It had acquired a faint edge, the way kind voices do when the kindness is not working. Perhaps we might allow those with the proper standing to evaluate these matters. Miss Merton will read, said the Viscount from the bookcase. He said only those 4 words. He said them in the voice of a man who has said very little all morning because he has been listening, and who speaks now because everything that needed to be known has been gathered, and the speaking can begin. It was a quiet voice. In a room of that size, with attention arranged as it was sufficient. Cecily had noted in the hours since the reading began 3 separate moments in which he had done something precise and small and entirely deniable. The first was when Cranby produced the document and set it before her, and the Viscount had shifted his weight, a fraction, the way a person shifts when something in a room has required their body to adjust its readiness. The second was when Mrs. Pell made her initial observation about the charming nature of female education. He had said nothing, but he had turned his gaze from the window to Cranby, and the quality of that gaze was not neutral. The third was when Cranby had attempted to redirect the reading past Cecily's objection, and the Viscount had drawn one breath, measured and deliberate, the breath of a man deciding whether to speak, and then he had spoken. She had read all three. She had read them, as she read text, carefully and without attribution beyond what the evidence supported. She understood that they supported something. She did not yet know what to do with that understanding, and this was not the moment to determine it. This was the moment to read. There are stories in which it is the man who acts and the woman who waits to be acted upon. This is not that story. If you have stayed with it to this point, you already know what it is. Cecily picked up the document. There was no question in it. He was not asking anyone's permission. Cranby looked at him. Something traveled between the two men, some acknowledgement of the specific weight that a Viscount's 4 words carry in a room, and then Cranby looked back at his document and said nothing further. If you had been standing in the Merton drawing room on that October morning, you might have thought the woman who rose to read was simply following an instruction. She rose carefully, with the care of someone who has been cold for a long time and has learned not to let it show in the body. She took up the document, and she took up the grammar. She read. She did not perform outrage. She did not appeal to the room's sympathies. She named the errors as she had named them in the library, precisely, and without commentary beyond what was factual, moving through the 4th clause with the grammar open beside her, to show her father's own hand on the conjugation question, then the 5th clause with her father's letter laid alongside, then the 6th clause, the tenterst, which was not Latin in any period she could name. The room listened. There was in it a specific quality of attention that she had not felt in 8 months, which was that people were hearing her, not processing her, not waiting for her to finish so they could explain why she was mistaken, hearing her the way one hears a thing when one cannot find the response that would put it away. When she set the document down, Mrs. Pell's fan was still. If you would like to stay with this story until it resolves, this is the moment to settle in, because what comes next will matter, and it matters most when it is not rushed. Cranby spoke. He spoke in the voice of a man recalibrating rather than retreating, which is a specific and unpleasant sound. He said the document was a legitimate legal instrument. He said, stylistic variation in Latin will formulations was common, and reflected the hand of his own clerk rather than the testator's preferences. He said that Miss Merton's classical education, while admirable, was not a qualification to challenge a document executed by a solicitor of his standing. He said it smoothly. 30 years of being believed had made him fluent in the language of certainty. Mrs. Pell found her footing alongside him, as she had been arranged to do. She said she admired learning in young women very much. She always had. It was charming, and she found it entirely to Cecily's credit. She said it the way one says a thing that means something other than what the words announce. Then she addressed her son, not quite quietly enough, and said that a pauper's daughter's classical education did not supersede a solicitor's documentation, and that her son's inheritance had been established in law, and the matter was really quite settled. Mr. Pell looked at the carpet. His expression was that of a man who would very much prefer to be somewhere else, and cannot at this precise moment find a dignified route to anywhere. Cecily heard it. She kept her face where she had put it. And then Cranby produced the second document. It came from his coat, folded, and he opened it with the unhurried confidence of a man keeping his best card until the hand requires it. A debt instrument, he explained. A note of hand signed by the late Reverend Merton acknowledging a sum of £240 owed to Cranby's firm, secured against the estate. The debt, he said, predated the will in legal effect. It would supersede the contested bequests regardless of how the will's Latin was parsed. He placed it on the table. The room was still in the way of a conclusion rather than a question. Mrs. Merton made a small sound beside Cecily. Cecily placed her hand over her mother's without looking at her. She looked at the signature at the foot of the debt instrument. Her father had signed his name with a narrow-nibbed pen he had owned for 20 years. She knew the quality of his upstrokes, the particular thinness of them, the way his capital R leaned against the consonant that followed it as though it needed the support. She had seen that signature on 50 letters, on 2 property documents, on the certificate of her own baptism and the certificate of her brother's. The signature on the debt instrument was not her father's. She knew it as surely as she had known the Latin was wrong. She had no instrument with which to prove it. The grammar was proof of the will. She had nothing for the debt. She set the grammar down on the desk. Her hands needed somewhere to be. She was aware of the cold that had moved into her chest, and of her mother breathing beside her, and of the particular quality of the light at 4 o'clock in October when the afternoon is finishing, before anyone is quite ready for it. She was aware of the clerk's pen, which had resumed its motion. She was aware of Cranby's hands, which were steady. There had been a moment, an hour before, when the reading paused for the distribution of tea. It was a brief interval, 15 minutes at most, during which Mrs. Pell took her refreshment, and Cranby conferred with his clerk and Mr. First. Pell stood near the window with the expression of a man who had not been told he would find the afternoon unpleasant. Cecily had gone into the passage for the simple reason that she needed to be out of the room for a moment, away from Cranby's studied patience and Mrs. Pell's arrangement of her skirts. Nathaniel had followed her. Not immediately, not in a way that anyone would have noted. He had appeared at the passage door 2 minutes after she did, and he had said, without preamble, that he would like to tell her something before the reading resumed. She had looked at him. He told her about his father's estate. He did not take long. He said that his father had died when Nathaniel was 24, and that within 3 months of the funeral, a claim had been lodged against the estate by a distant creditor, whose documentation, it later emerged, had been partially falsified by the solicitor managing the estate's affairs. The claim had not been fraudulent in its entirety, which made it considerably harder to contest. The litigation had run for 5 years. 5 years during which the estate's income was frozen and its management uncertain, during which his mother had lived in a state of suspended uncertainty that aged her a decade, and during which his younger sister had refused 2 offers of marriage because their financial situation was unresolved. And she would not bring a man into it. He said it plainly. He did not perform the grief that it clearly still produced in him. His voice was the same voice he used for everything, but his hands, she noticed, were very still at his sides, the stillness of a man managing something that has not been resolved simply because the legal matter was. "I recognized what was happening here," he said within 2 days of arriving. "Why did you not say so immediately?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because I did not want to tell you I believed you until I could prove it. I've spent enough years in rooms where belief without proof changes nothing." He looked at her face. "I should have found a way to tell you that I had seen what you had seen, that the 8 months were not yours alone." She did not know what to say to this. She was aware that the tea interval would conclude and that they would need to return to the drawing room, and she was aware also of the passage wall behind her, and the thin autumn light from the window at the end of it, and the particular quality of standing with a man who has just said something that cost him something, and is waiting to see how it lands. "You are telling me now," she said. "Yes," he said. They returned to the drawing room. Cranby resumed his reading. She looked up at him. He was looking at the debt instrument. His face was not readable in the way that most faces are readable. She had been watching him for 2 days, and she had the specific attentiveness of a woman who reads things others do not bother to read, and she understood that what she was seeing was not acceptance. It was a calculation reaching its final stage. He did not look at her. She thought, he will say these matters require the court. He will say it with genuine regret. He will be right. And by the time the courts have concluded their process, she will be 40 years old, and her mother will be in a small lodging somewhere, and the library will have been dispersed, and her father's name will be attached to a debt he never owed, and a signature that was never his. She was very still. Mrs. Pell said the matter appeared settled. Cranby said he would proceed to the formalities. The clerk dipped his pen. "The debt instrument," said Nathaniel Ashby, "is also a forgery." He said it in the same voice he used for everything, which was quiet and level and contained no request for the room's agreement. Cranby's pen stopped. The clerk's pen stopped. Everyone in the room stopped, in the way of a room that has run against a wall it did not know was there. Nathaniel reached into his coat and produced a letter. It was sealed with a London solicitor's frank and addressed to him personally at Ashby Hall, and it was dated 9 days prior. He opened it without urgency. He did not read the full letter aloud. He summarized, because he was speaking to the room rather than to a court. He had, he said, engaged a firm in London with expertise in the forensic examination of disputed documents, specifically the analysis of ink composition, paper characteristics, and pen formation in contested wills. He had sent them the family's copy of the will 12 days ago, having obtained it with the vicar's cooperation, since the vicar had been holding the family's copy in the vestry as a precaution, at Nathaniel's suggestion, since the week he arrived in Sallerton. He had also sent the firm a substantial sample of the late Reverend Merton's established correspondence, obtained from the same source. The London firm's findings were in the letter. The will was not in the late Reverend's hand across its 4th through 7th clauses. The ink in those clauses did not match the ink in the first 3, indicating the document had been produced in stages by more than one writer. The signature bore characteristics inconsistent with the late Reverend's established pen formation across more than 30 letters. He folded the letter. In the silence that followed, he looked at Cecily. Not for long. Just the duration of a breath. Less than that. Something in his face opened in a way that was very small and very deliberate, the way a locked room looks when the door has been properly opened, rather than forced. "Miss Merton's Latin is flawless," he said. "It is the will that is not." He said it to the room, not to her. He said it as a man states a conclusion derived from evidence rather than preference, and then he turned to Mr. Tate, the magistrate, who had risen from his chair in the corner with the careful deliberation of a man who knows what his rising means and means it to be understood. Cranby spoke. He said a number of things. They had the quality of speech in a room that has already decided, which is to say they fell without echo. His confidence had not precisely collapsed, but it had undergone the specific alteration of a structure whose load-bearing element has been removed. The facade remained. Nothing behind it bore any weight. The room was watching Cecily, not with the polite, managed attention of the drawing-room's earlier arrangement, but with the specific attention of people who have been shown something and are in the process of understanding it. The vicar's wife had a hand pressed against her collar. Mr. Tate was already on his feet. Even the clerk, who had spent the afternoon as an instrument rather than a person, had looked up from his writing table and was looking at the grammar on the desk, with the expression of a man who will have something to tell his household tonight. Mr. Tate asked to see the documents. He asked for the London firm's name. He asked Cranby several questions of a procedural nature, in the measured tone of a man who is assembling what he will need for a formal proceeding in a very near future. Mrs. Pell's posture remained excellent, because it was the sort of posture one develops over 50 years. Her fan was resting across her knee, still, and she did not look at Cranby, and she did not look at her son. She looked at the window with the expression of a woman calculating the distance between where she had expected to be by 4 o'clock and where she actually was. It was a long distance. Mr. Pell removed himself from the room without speaking. Under the circumstances, Cecily thought it was the most dignified option available to him. She stood very still. Nathaniel crossed the room to her. Not with urgency, not in any way that performed itself for the watching room. He walked as he always moved, with the measured economy of a man who has long understood that rooms observe him and has decided not to perform for them, and also not to give them anything unnecessary to observe. He stopped when he reached her with the proper distance between them, which, in another context, would have been merely polite. In this one it felt like something held very carefully at the rim of its container. He looked at the grammar on the desk. He looked at her. "You were not wrong," he said. "About any of it." She found for a moment that she had nothing to say. She found also that the cold which had sat in her chest since Cranby produced the second document had eased. Not entirely. Not all at once. But in the way that cold eases when a door has been opened in a room that has been shut too long and the air is different now and will continue to be different. She breathed. The evening that followed was long and procedural. Mr. Tate remained for 2 hours. He examined both documents, the London firm's letter, the sample correspondence. He spoke to Cranby with the formal patience of a man conducting an inquiry rather than a conversation. He spoke to Cecily directly, which she noted with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has learned not to expect such things and has not yet unlearned the capacity to be glad when they arrive. Nathaniel remained. He sat near the fireplace and answered the magistrate's questions with the compressed clarity of a man who has done this before and knows what is useful and what is not. And once, when the candles had burned lower and the room was quieter, he looked up from the letter he was reviewing and found Cecily, watching him from across the room. And he held her gaze for one still moment, long enough to be a choice. Before returning to the document, she was aware of her face, which was warm. She was aware of her hands, which were steady. These two facts occupied her somewhat for the remainder of the evening. She slept better than she had in 8 months. He called on the third morning. Formally with his card sent ahead, which made Mrs. Bitten. Merton asked from her pillow whether she ought to dress properly, and she rose and dressed properly because she had been raised in a time when such things were answered in the affirmative and she had not forgotten it. Cecily was already in the garden. She had the grammar with her because she had begun, in the weeks of waiting for the estate matters to conclude their formal process, to transcribe her father's annotations into a fair copy notebook. It was a task that occupied her hands, and that felt in a way she could not quite name, like continuing something he had not finished, like making sure his opinion survived since he had not been permitted to ensure the survival of his property. He found her on the bench under the copper beech. The light was clear and thin, the kind that comes in late autumn when the leaves have thinned and the sky is particular. He sat at the other end of the bench with the proper space between them. He did not begin with pleasantries. "How does it proceed?" he asked. She told him what she knew, which was not much beyond what he likely knew, since Tate corresponded with him. He listened as though the information were new. There was quiet. The garden held it without difficulty. "I owe you an explanation," he said, after a moment. She looked at him. He was watching a point somewhere beyond the beach, the estate wall, the gray stone of it. "I came to Sallerton because your father's letter concerned me. He did not say he suspected fraud. He said only that he had some uncertainty about his affairs, and that if things became complicated, he would be grateful for the attention of someone he trusted." A pause. "I arrived too late to speak with him." "Yes," Cecily said. "I examined the will when I arrived, and I knew within an hour that it was wrong. Knowing and proving are not the same thing. I needed the forensic letter. I needed time." "You could have told me," she said. "Not as an accusation." As an observation, he looked at her. "Then, I considered it." "What?" "I decided instead to come to the library at 3:30 on a Tuesday, because the vicar had mentioned that you spent your afternoons there with your father's books. And I wanted to understand how much you already knew before I said anything that might either alarm you unnecessarily or deprive you of the satisfaction of saying it yourself." She was quiet for a moment. "The satisfaction," she said. "It was your work," he said. 8 months of it. I had 12 days and a London firm with instruments I could pay for. You had a grammar and a pen and a certainty you could not prove. I thought you deserved to be the one to say it aloud in that room." She looked at the grammar in her hands. She thought about the 8 months and the fool's cap in the fire, and the mornings when the certainty had not felt like much against the weight of 30 years of Cranby's reputation. She thought about sitting at her father's desk in the cold, with no one to tell. "That was," she said carefully, "either very thoughtful or very managing. I have not yet decided which." Something happened to his face, so quickly she might have imagined it. The corner of his mouth moved in a direction that was not quite a smile, but that contained the memory of one. Both. Probably, he said. I have been told I am managing. By whom? My mother. Regularly. He looked at the grammar. Your father annotated the page on the participial in red ink. He felt strongly about the participial. I noticed he has written a single word in the margin 7 times. He was consistent, Cecily said, in his opinions. He was not wrong, Nathaniel said. He said it in the same voice he had used in the drawing room, the same level, certain, register. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, which was without asking the room's permission. There was quiet. The beach shed 2 leaves onto the bench between them, slow and without purpose. She was aware of him at the other end of the bench, the specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who has nothing to say, but the stillness of a man who is saying something without speaking. She was aware of his hand near hers on the cover of the grammar, not touching, close enough that she felt the warmth of it at the edge of her own. May I read them? He said. The annotations when there is time. When the estate is settled. He looked at her. I would like to know what he thought. She understood with the precision she brought to every text she had ever read, that he was not asking about a grammar. Yes, she said, when there is time. He nodded once, the way he made all his smallest agreements, as though they cost something, and he was not reluctant to pay. The copper beech held a few last leaves against the October sky, pale amber and brown, backlit by the thin, clear sun. Her father's grammar lay open across her knees, his handwriting small and deliberate in the margins, still insisting, still certain. All his opinions intact, and waiting for someone who would take the time to understand them. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the house she could hear her mother asking the cook about dinner, which was the sound of ordinary life resuming, which was the sound she had been waiting 8 months to hear. His hand rested near hers on the worn cover. She did not move away.